As Jonathan said, I'm Megan Benjamin. I'm with Maryland Environmental Trust. I work from Garrett County, where I grew up, all the way over to Harford County, a 7-county region. We have 2 other planners that cover the state, Ann Carlson on the Eastern Shore and John Turgeon in Southern Maryland. And I'm going to talk about conservation easements in general tonight. I'm going to start by saying this isn't my presentation, but that's a good thing because if I mess up, we'll just go back to that point. But hopefully I know what I'm talking about as we go through. If you have any questions as we go, feel free to interrupt and we'll take questions as we go. So we're going to go through what is a conservation easement. And in Maryland, we are very fortunate to have a number of options of easement programs throughout the state. We have donated easements, which that's MET primarily. We also have local land trusts that work throughout the state, and we partner with whenever we're working in an area where we also have a local land trust partner. So we do primarily the donated conservation easements. There is Maryland Agricultural Land Preservation, MALP, which focuses primarily on ag, including forest land. Rural Legacy, where you have to be in a designated rural legacy area. Forest Legacy, which is a federal program and administered through the Department of Natural Resources. There are transfer of development right programs and installment purchase agreement, IPA programs in certain counties as well. So here's our numbers to date through the various programs, permanently preserved acres throughout the state. So what is a conservation easement? Several of you, I saw your hands up, you have conservation easements on your property. A conservation easement is a legal agreement. It's a deed of conservation easement. So it is recorded in land records. It becomes a part of the chain of title, and it's perpetual. It's an agreement between the landowner and the land trust or government body that is permanently limiting the use of the land to protect what we call the conservation values. So agricultural land, forest land, open space, scenic benefits, the public good of what we're looking to protect. But it remains private property. It's still your private property to own, pass on to your heirs, manage, as long as it falls in line with the easement. So again, the types of easements. There are purchase easements. There are different programs that offer a lump sum payment up front when you do the easement. There are also the installment purchase programs, which we'll talk about, but you get paid over a period of time. The donated conservation easement, where there are tax benefits that you can be eligible for the donation of the easement. And then transfer of development right programs, which we'll cover. So oftentimes when you talk about conservation easements, people use the analogy of a bundle of sticks. And this diagram shows you have the different property rights. The easement value is based on primarily the right to develop, the development rights and the subdivision rights. And then the after value is still all of those sticks that you have to begin with. So the farming rights, the timber rights, the mineral rights, the, just the right to the development that you have there as it is. And again, the point that this still is private property after the easement is in place. So typically what easement programs are looking to protect are prime agricultural soils, farmland, large blocks of forest land that can be for habitat or timber use, scenic view from a public space, so from a public roadway or waterway, a public park. Right here at Antietam, the scenic viewshed of the battlefield. Historic resources, be it designated historic districts or specific historic structures on a property, as well as environmentally sensitive lands, habitat. And in general, the things that an easement is typically prohibiting. So you are in the easement, what's going to be very clear in all of them is whatever subdivision and future residential development of the property will be clearly outlined. So in some programs you can reserve the right to develop a house in the future or to subdivide a portion of the property. But the majority of those rights you're going to be giving up in the easement to keep the property, for the most part, intact as it is. You'll be limiting the commercial development of the property. So things other than agriculture, including forestry, will be limited in a conservation easement. You can still have things like in-home offices, but otherwise the property, by and large, you're going to be limiting any commercial use of the property, like I said, other than agriculture. Dumping, gravel pits, billboards. These are things that the easement is going to place limits on. So this is for a donated hypothetical scenario of how you develop or how you come up with the value of the easement. So there would be a value given to the property, the whole entire farm as it is today. And then they would take a look at the value, the agricultural forestry value of the property. And the difference in those values is the value of the conservation easement. So with MET, and some of these will apply if you work just with a local land trust, but the state and property tax credits, those are with MET, and or if you donate to MALF or the Department of Natural Resources, these can apply too. So the federal benefit is a deduction. It allows you to deduct 50% of your adjusted gross income in the year of the donation, and you can carry that forward for 16 years or until you reach the value of the donation. If you're a full-time farmer or rancher, you can deduct up to 100% of your adjusted gross income, again, over 16 years. So with this scenario, if the landowner's adjusted gross income filing as a head of household is $150,000 in year one, he can deduct 50% of his AGI for tax savings, a little over $15,000. He can carry that forward until he reaches the total value of his donation, $400,000 for $82,000, almost $83,000 in tax savings in that time. This all depends on the landowner's income as well as the value of the easement. So, you would plug in your own income level and what the appraisal might be worth to see how many years you could carry it forward. You can carry it forward for, like I said, 16 years total. And the state income tax benefit is an actual credit, and a credit on what you owe on your state income taxes. So this is pretty very valuable incentive. So it's $5,000 per owner. So if the property is owned by a husband and a wife, they could have a credit of up to $10,000 per year, and that can be carried forward for 16 years total, or $80,000 per person, or $160,000 per couple. Again, or until you reach the value of the donation. You can also take the state benefit as a deduction, but it's usually, for most folks, more valuable as an actual credit on the state income taxes. There are also estate tax benefits if those apply to you and if you're holding the property at the time of your passing. We talk about them. There's two ways that you get estate taxes by having an easement. There's the reduction in value. So by having an easement on the property, you're reducing what the highest and best use of the property is, reducing the value of it. So you'll be taxed on less. And then you can do an actual exclusion up of 40% of the land value up to $500,000 per owner for land that is subject to a donated conservation easement. So if estate taxes are something that you are concerned about, a donated easement is something to consider. And then there's the property tax credit. So for the unimproved portion of the property tax is zeroed out for 15 years. After the 15 years, you would be held at no more than the highest ag rate, which I think now is $500 an acre. Unless you're enrolled in another program that would bump that down further. But for 15 years, you would pay no property tax on the unimproved portion. You would still pay property tax on your improved area, which is the majority of where your property taxes are. But there are some counties that offer extra incentives. So depending on where you are, there are some counties that do, if you have a conservation easement, they would include the improved area. I think some places they also, it goes beyond 15 years. So that's something to look at depending on where you are. So this is my job right here, the process for donating a conservation easement. So myself or my colleagues, we get a call from a landowner. We take a look at the property to see if it looks on the screen on GIS like something that would meet our criteria. If so, we come out for a field visit. We do extra research and evaluation. We talk about your goals that you have for the property and talk about our easement and general criteria. The one plug I'll give for donated conservation easements is that with our program, there's a little bit more flexibility and leeway for negotiating the terms. Some of the purchase programs, basically, this is what you're offered, this is what it is. But with our program, there's a little bit more, there can be more discussion. We certainly have criteria, but we take into account your long-term goals and we can negotiate the easement. The appraisal process that we talked about, the appraisal is more than just your standard property appraisal. It's kind of two appraisals in one. It's appraising the value of the property as it is today, the highest and best use, what you can do by zoning, and then it's taking a look at the easement and what you're giving up in the easement. And it's giving a value for both of those scenarios, and the difference in those values, like I said, is the value of your donation and what your tax benefits, the income tax benefits, are based on. If you get an appraisal as part of your decision-making process, which a lot of people do, we just pay attention to the timing because you have to have it within 60 days of when the easement is recorded, or you might have to have it done again or have a bring-to-date letter. So to save you money, we try to work with you on the timing so you only have to pay once. If you do it after, go ahead. You're talking about the different programs, or? So we have our template easement that all our easements are based on. So that lays out the general, flow and look at what we're limiting. And then we have our policy that's available to show like what we're looking for. I guess there are different parts of the easement that we don't just prepare the easement and say, this is what you're doing. You have a chance to look at it as a landowner, work with your attorney, or read through it. If you have questions, if there's something that is doesn't quite meet with what your expectations are, then I'm trying to think of an example of what that might be, but it's not just like some of the programs where they're paying you, so this is what you get. There is a back and forth that can happen with a donated easement. Right. So with donated easements, I would say our criteria are more broad than some of the purchase programs. So we generally are looking for properties that are 25 acres and over. We have criteria that we can look at smaller properties if they meet additional criteria, if they're adjacent to other protected lands, if they have sensitive species, if they are a little bit more extraordinary in some way. So our acreage, I think, is smaller than some of the other programs like MALF. I think they start at 50 acres. Go ahead. Yes. Yep, so we could look at your property as a whole. We have criteria where if there are a number of neighbors that are all interested, we can look at the area as a whole when we're considering it. Yeah. Is there a question here? Yeah. Not for, that might be for one of the purchase programs, or maybe they meant by that you don't have development rights. If you don't have a wide enough access, you couldn't develop it further than what it is. So, but we can consider a property whether it has development rights or not, because zoning changes. Zoning can change, so having development rights isn't necessarily one of the criteria we look at. We check that with the county to see what the development potential is. So you might, but that's not like one of the major factors. One of the overall, what we're looking for is that there are conservation values associated with the property. Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's rural legacy or mouth. I'll go through some of the purchase options, but in Allegheny County, it's probably one of those. Mm-hmm. So lien subordination, so if you have a deed of trust or a mortgage on your property, we would work to prepare a document that the bank would need to sign off on. Since it will come before the easement and the chain of title, the bank has to agree that if the loan is defaulted on, that they would recognize the easement. That's a requirement of the IRS, so that it's perpetual. So that is sometimes the longest part of our process, is working with the bank. So we try to get started on that early. All of our easements are approved by our board of trustees. Just a little bit about MET. So we were established in 1967. We accepted our first easement in 1972. We hold easements throughout the state. I think we hold around 170,000 acres throughout the state, and about 1,100 easements. And I have our latest newsletter and brochures in the back. I'll just mention that now while I remember. And then all parties agree, they sign the easement. All of our easements go to the State Board of Public Works, which make you eligible for the specific state tax benefits. And then the easements are recorded in your county. So the costs associated with donating a conservation easement, there is the cost of the appraisal, which as I mentioned, is more in depth than just a typical property appraisal. We usually find that these run about $2,000 to $5,000 per easement, which is significant, but most landowners find that is worth the cost of doing for the tax benefits that you get. And I believe the appraisal, that's a deductible cost of your transaction, so you can work with your accountant to lessen that burden as well. So they are expensive, but people find that they are worth it. Yeah. Well, so for the federal tax benefit, the IRS has a whole list of qualifying criteria for what has to be in a donated conservation easement appraisal, as well as the qualifications of the appraiser. So they're looking, it's the before value and the after value, and there are specific rules about how they have to be appraised. So if you or a family member owns a property adjacent, that has to be taken into consideration, because if you're putting an easement on this property, is there a private benefit to your family member for now having property next to preserved land? So it's just more complicated than your standard property appraisal. Sure. If you have an attorney or financial advisor you work with, which we always certainly recommend, that would be a cost to you. And then stewardship contribution. So whenever MET or any local land trust is taking on accepting a conservation easement, we're taking on, we're agreeing to the perpetual responsibility to care for and steward that conservation easement. So there are costs associated with that in the long term. For MET, we ask for a contribution after the fact. It doesn't impact our decision of whether or not we accept an easement, but we let you know up front that you'll be asked for that, so it doesn't come as a surprise. Some land trusts have an upfront administrative cost to work with them because MET benefits as being, we're part of the Department of Natural Resources. But a lot of the local land trusts are nonprofit organizations, so they have to cover their costs up front. So that's just something to consider. It really varies. Some land trusts just have a set fee. Some base it on, they have formulas where they come up with a number. It really runs the spectrum of how that works. But MET asks for a donation of $5,000 after the fact. It can be like pledged over a period of time. You don't have to give it, but we ask for it. So stewardship, that's just what we term our long-term responsibility with the easement. So we maintain a relationship with the landowner, any future landowner. We come out periodically to visit the property, make sure there aren't condos or Ferris wheels that aren't supposed to be there. And there are certain things in the easement that will require future approval. So if you reserve the right to build a residence in the future, when that time comes, you come to us. There's a process, so that's our role, our responsibility ongoing. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yep. So yeah, that's certainly tax deductible. Sometimes if the local land trust is asking for an administrative fee, that might not be tax deductible if it's something you have to pay to give. I'm actually not sure how they structure that, but ours is definitely deductible. Yeah. So on to the purchase program. So the Maryland Agricultural Land Preservation Program, they've been around since 1977. They're the second oldest purchase development right program in the country. They are governed by a board of trustees, but administered locally. Each county has an administrator for MALF. And the funding cycle has 2 rounds, one based on how it ranks within the county, and then a second based on the lowest bidder. That's a statewide second round. So the steps, submitting the application, July 1st is the deadline. Each county does an approval and ranking of applications. With MALF, and I'm not an expert in MALF, but as I understand it, the value that you are paid for the MALF easement, there's a formula that they use, and it's the ag land, the value of the ag land that you're paid for. And each county is a little bit different in how their formula works. But as part of the application process, landowners can also submit essentially bids if they're willing to accept a little bit lower than what the highest they could be paid. If they would accept lower, that can change their ranking and how they might end up with an offer at the end. So the round 1 offers are made, as I said, based on the county ranking and how they rate and how the county would desire to see, like first, second, third level. And then if you don't get an offer on that round, there's also the possibility of getting a second round offer, which I think that's where the bidding comes a little bit more into play, and that's looked at a statewide level, if I understand that correctly. And then the landowner can accept or reject the offer, and then it goes to settlement. Does anyone have a MALF easement on their property? Those of you that have an easement? Well, as I said, each county has an administrator, and if you look on their website, you can find who it is for your county. Okay, here. So, farm and forest land owners outside of designated sewer service areas are eligible. They are looking for parcel sizes of 50 acres, unless you are adjacent, and I guess they have criteria that you can be accepted smaller than 50 acres if you're part of a larger block of protected land. And one of the prime factors that they're looking for is your prime soils, or woodland, group 1 or 2 soils. And an approved and up-to-date forest stewardship plan is required if you have forest on your property. Retained residential rights. So if you, with mouth, you can either choose to exclude a portion of the property up front if you want to retain the right to develop in the future, or you can choose one of 3 options. Family lots, where you could retain up to 3, the right for 3 family lots. You could retain the right to 1 unrestricted lots, or you could waive the right to do any future lots in the future. Just to go back to MT, how we deal with that. So usually if a landowner, usually we work entire properties. Of course, a landowner could choose to exclude a portion of the property, or if they wanted to maintain a development right, they would write in the easement that they have the right to whatever it is in the future, a primary development right, and the right to subdivide that on a minimum size lot. At the time that you choose to exercise that right, then there's an approval process that we go through. We basically look to make sure you don't want to put it right in the middle of a field, an agricultural field, or right in the middle of your forest, just to minimize. You just need to check that the conservation values that the easement was created to protect are being maintained when you exercise that right. Rural Legacy, created in 1997. It's a competitive process. There are 32 or 33 Rural Legacy areas across the state. There was just a new one created this year, the Harriet Tubman Rural Legacy area on the Eastern Shore. These are purchased conservation easements. You have to be within one of the designated areas to qualify for these. And they use, to value the easement, they use a point system. It's also a formula. They call it an easement valuation system. And as I understand it, you can be paid if you choose to incorporate certain best management practices as part of the easement. You can be paid more for the easement. And something to mention, so the same piece of property, you could be paid if you were considered under mouth and considered under Rural Legacy. You could be paid different amounts for those easements. So that's, and probably if you donated it, you might come up with a different value that your tax benefits would be based on, which is interesting, but these are formulas that work for the different programs, I guess. The Rural Legacy process, the application, typically February 1st is the deadline. Again, a scoring process for all of the applications. DNR staff makes the recommendations to the Rural Legacy Advisory Board in May or June, and the Advisory Board reviews them. And the offers, the disbursement of funds to the different areas are made, and then they can close on the properties that rank high enough to get the funding. As I understand it, maybe don't quote me, I'll turn this off right now. I think each area, I think each area is awarded their pot of money, and then they can choose, they would go to their first property, first ranked property, and they would see how far the funding goes to get all the easements. Forest Legacy is a federal program administered through the Department of Natural Resources. It was created by Congress to protect large contiguous tracts of privately owned forest land. And estates apply on a yearly basis for funding, and it's you're competing across the country. So in Maryland, I looked up today, there are 9 easements across Maryland covering 2,000 acres. So that's a highly competitive program. These are the areas, forest legacy areas in Maryland. So if you are in one of these, then you can contact this person to see how you might go about that process. Do you have that somewhere else? Okay. So transfer of development rights programs. So with TDR programs, there are TDR programs in 10 counties in Maryland. And so the county sets up a program where there is a sending area, the rural area, and a receiving area, the area where they're wanting to focus development. So this is an example from Burlington County, New Jersey. Predominantly rural and agricultural setting. They set up a sending area, the majority of the county, and then the receiving area where they wanted to, like I said, focus some more intense development. So in Maryland, the counties that have a TDR program: Calvert, Caroline, Cecil, Charles, Hartford, Howard, Montgomery, Queen Anne, St. Mary's, and Wicomico. So you would go to your county that administers these programs to see how it works in each county. You have to be obviously in the sending area to apply, and then you have these credits that you can sell to developers for the receiving area. So you would receive a value for the development rights you're giving up in that process. Installment purchase agreement programs. So I don't have a list of the counties that have these, but there are several counties in Maryland that have IPA programs. They were developed by Howard County in the late 80s as a way to make the county's investment go a little bit further. So they, depending on the bond market, the government puts in a certain amount, usually 20 to 50 cents on the dollar for the value of the easement up front, and the landowner receives tax-free interest payments for 20 years, and then at the end of the 20 years, they get a balloon principal payment. So depending on your situation, and if your county has one of these programs, that's a nice option, and the counties, like I said, it allows their dollar to go a little bit further. So Howard, Hartford, Carroll County, these are what they've done to date with the IPA programs. I don't know which other counties have them. I know Frederick County has an IPA program, but there might be others. I'm not certain on that. But the counties like these. So these are, all the benefits. I think I mentioned them. And yeah, it all depends on your situation. Some people this will work really well for. And more information about IPAs: Bill Amos in Hartford County, Deborah Bowers in Carroll, Stephen Winter, an attorney, Ann Bradley in Frederick County. She's another resource for the IPA program.